Hello and welcome to today's Australian Water School webinar covering climate change updates to the Australian Rainfall and Runoff Guidelines. We'll be joined in a few minutes by an expert panel. This is our biggest panel yet, including some of the authors who literally wrote the book on the subject. But we don't want to just credit the authors today. We also need to acknowledge that the guidelines were developed in conjunction with industry, which is all of you, and during the comment period on the draft chapter. Many of today's webinar attendees contributed to these updates as well. So thanks to everyone who played a role in that effort. And thanks to all the attendees out there for taking the time to be with us today. Let's have a look at a map and let's see who's joining us today. Even though we've got an Australian focus with our topic, climate change knows no borders, as they say. And from a look at this map, neither do these webinars. Now, if you're looking for some background into how to apply Australian Rainfall and Runoff Guidelines, we'd invite you to register for the Australian Water School's 8-part course. You can see your instructors right here on the screen, many of whom are with us today and have been a part of other free webinars that are available for you right now to watch for free with content covering climate change, extreme events, probable maximum precipitation, the ARR Guidelines, and other material that's relevant to today's topic. So we'll post links to those webinars in the live chat and also in the YouTube description if you'll be watching this as a recording. So let's bring on our presenters and panelists. If you can all turn your cameras on, let's have you go around the room, basically, and let us know who you are and essentially what your role has been in these updates. Conrad, let's start with you. Give us a quick introduction.
Yeah, I'm Conrad Wasco. I'm currently a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. I was previously at the University of Melbourne, and I co-led the technical working group with Seth Westra.
Excellent. Over to you, Monique.
I'm Monique Rotalik. I'm the incoming chair for the National Committee on Water Engineering that's responsible for ARR and one of the editors of ARR 2019. In my day job, I work for WMA Water as a member of the project control group for this update.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Acacia.
Hi, I'm Acacia Pepler. I'm a senior research scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology, where I work on how weather systems and rainfall are changing in a changing climate. And for the ARR review, I was involved in the science side, so the systematic review of what literature there is on extreme rainfall and how it's changing.
Perfect. Seth.
Yeah, hello. So my name's Seth Westra. I'm a professor of hydrology and climate risk at the University of Adelaide. And with Conrad, I co-led the technical working group and a co-author of the updated guidance chapter.
Excellent. Leanne is next.
Hi, I'm Leanne Haupt. I'm the Director of Climate Science at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, the Commonwealth Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. We have been leading the development of the updated guidance in collaboration with Engineers Australia.
Excellent. Some big acronyms that we all need to keep track of today. Chris, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Chris Nielsen, Director of Dam Safety for the Department of Regional Development, Manufacturing and Water in Queensland. I've been a working group member here. I have a hydraulics and hydrology background as well as my dam safety role. And I also have climate, I'm the chair of the Civil College Board for Engineers Australia, under which the National Committee of Water Engineering resides.
Excellent. Mark?
Mark Babbister from WMA Water. I'm one of the editors of ARR, but in this particular chapter, I'm sort of the practitioner member of the technical working group.
Excellent. And last but not least, over to Rory.
Yeah, hi there. So I'm Rory Nathan. I'm a professor of hydrology and water resources at the University of Melbourne. And on this chapter, I was on the project controls group, helping that process. But also I was a co-author both on the science paper on which the guidance is based and the ARR chapter on which the guidance is based.
Excellent. Rory, any comments on the poll questions? I don't know if you see the poll come up on your screen. Essentially, we've got a pretty big split in some of the ways in which people are going to use the guidance, the ways they intend to, but then a few of them got zero responses at all. And so I wanted to just check and see if you had any comments on any surprises that you see from the poll results.
Well, look, the truth is that we needed it, but climate change is a global problem and a global crisis. Look, it's interesting. There's the two main groups really are kind of decision makers in planning and government, and consulting service providers who provide the estimates on which the decisions are made. So that's a really strong and obvious split. The other thing that kind of strikes me is that we're broadly across the areas. Australian Rainfall and Runoff really kind of covers both drainage design, floodplain management, and dams, and they're the three main groupings we're seeing there. So I feel we've got the right target audience is well matched to what the intent of the guidelines are.
Yes, I believe so. So thanks for that. Now, if Conrad is going to start off here with a presentation, we're going to have two formal presentations. So the way this is going to work, all of the presenters and panelists that you just saw and heard from are going to drop into the background and address your questions on the content that you see coming up. So Conrad's going to give us a presentation here on the updated guidance. We're going to then hear from Monique with another presentation. And then following that, we're going to open it up and Rory is going to facilitate a panel discussion with the experts with some pre-selected questions, but also some that will be coming to us live from you today as the audience. So Conrad, I can see your screen just fine. Over to you. Look forward to being with you again shortly.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Craig. This will be a very short, brief presentation on the overall project. And so I just want to start with a bit of a project background to why this project was undertaken. And really, I need to point out that I'm presenting on behalf of DQ and Engineers Australia, who led this project and the technical working group among a cast of thousands in terms of who gave feedback to this. So why do we need to update ARR? I mean, I think we all know, speaking to the converted, ARR is heavily used in design practice for flood estimation. And traditionally, design flood estimation has assumes that the historical climate is representative of the future, but with climate change, that's no longer the case. And so as part of this project, we developed a discussion paper and put that out for feedback. And that was the first part of the project. And that discussion paper had a quote in there which was there to elicit feedback on. And so the quote is there. It was, as a result, practitioners feel hamstrung by the guidance that is currently provided, and decision makers are concerned that the latest science is not always being appropriately applied in policy outcomes. Now, at the time, 80% of respondents agreed with that statement. So really what that's saying is that in order to build confidence in our guidance, we need to be relying on the latest science. So hence this update, to update the science in the guidance. So in terms of the project structure, I was the co-lead of the technical working group, and we sat underneath or reported to the project control group, with the project being overall looked after by DQ and Engineers Australia. And as part of being part of the technical working group, we're responding to feedback from consultation that was ongoing during the process. So who was involved in the project? Well, you've met some of the members already, but here is actually a complete list of the technical working group members and the project control group members. So as Craig mentioned, you'll see there's a wide spread of people from government, industry, and academic institutions with broad backgrounds in hydrology, climate science, meteorology, and so forth. As part of that first phase of the discussion paper that was put out, there were some principles that were put into that discussion paper to guide the science review and the guidance document itself, which I'll talk to in a moment. And so just quickly touching on those principles, the first one was that we wanted to reflect the contemporary science. And I think that's pretty clear why that is the case. But there were other guiding principles as well. And one was at the aim to make the guidance practical and easy to use. So that really has the purpose of ensuring uptake of the guidance and that it's used in a consistent manner. The next point, being consistent and comprehensive, really goes to the point that we have this philosophy that if we have information, we'll try and put it in the guidance. And if we don't have information, we won't. That allowed it to be comprehensive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the information there will be used by the practitioner. So I think an example of that is the change in temporal patterns are observed historically is quite small. So it might not impact your decision making or your design flood estimate that much, but we included all the information that we had so that the document is as comprehensive as possible. And we want to reflect best practice around communication for uncertainty and risk. So what that means is wherever we could include uncertainty, we did, or we made an attempt to, and trying to use the language that climate scientists use. So if we're going to design with climate change in mind, and if we're getting a lot of our information from climate scientists, then we need to start using the language that they use. So the next step of the project was a scientific review. And science review has been published online. It's freely accessible. It's in an open access journal. And it was undertaken with two sort of methodologies. So one was that the review was undertaken as a systematic review. This means that all the search words that we use to gather literature are published alongside this document. All the documents that we found that are included in the guidance have been also published. So that in theory, if someone wants to repeat this process, they can go and do it, and the results are replicable. So you'll find hopefully the same literature that we did. The second part was a meta-analysis. So what that means is that any study that had a change in extreme rainfalls in it, it was standardized on a global temperature change, and this allowed us to compare across studies. So a meta-analysis means it was a formal quantitative way of comparing extreme rainfall changes from many different sources, allowing us to include multiple lines of evidence in our study. And that's quite unique in terms of being applied in this sort of scenario. So overall, we reviewed around 300 papers, really focusing on literature that was published since the past update to ARR. And like I said, everything is available online, including all the code that was used to do the meta-analysis as well, and the results of the meta-analysis. So following the science review, the guidance document was drafted. And here I just want to take a sort of a step back and really talk to the audience, to all of you directly, and say thank you for all your feedback. So there was a lot of feedback in terms of on the guidance document. And this is just one example of how the feedback worked. So I'll read that top line, the top quote, which is, following the science review, no defensible methods were identified for incorporating climate change into direct flood-based procedures such as flood frequency analysis. So that was what was in the original document. And we got a lot of feedback that was being interpreted as, well, you can't use flood frequency analysis at all. And we know that it's an important tool for calibrating our models and indeed estimating flood risk. And that wasn't our intention at all. Our intention was to say that if one is to project flood frequency analysis, it needs to be done in a way which takes into account the changes in the actual processes that are driving that change in your design flood. And so indeed, I won't read the next section, but one is that the text was updated in response to user feedback. And there are a lot of examples throughout the document that you'll see if you compare the draft, the document that is being published now with the draft that was published online. So I really appreciate the feedback. Clearly, a lot of people took a lot of time to give feedback on the document. And so because there was quite a lot of feedback, there's a frequently asked questions document published alongside the ARR guidance document as well. So onto the guidance itself, what has changed. So these are the high-level points. We now acknowledge that the IFDs are based on historical data, so they're not representative of the current and future climate. So that's one of the main changes. The other one is that now the rates of change applied to IFDs vary with storm duration, and they apply up to the PMP. Global temperatures have been used to project the IFDs. So if you're going to scale your IFDs, use global temperatures and not local temperatures. So local temperatures was what was used in the previous guidance document. And we provided guidance for other factors now, temporal patterns, losses, sea level, and I'll touch on those very, very, very briefly next slides. So the guidance for changes in rainfall intensity, it does acknowledge that for most Australian catchments, changes in extreme rainfall are likely to represent the primary mechanism for increases in flood risk. And the scaling factors are, as you can see below, in that quote, they are 15% per degree global warming for hourly rainfall and 8% per degree warming for daily rainfalls. And you'll see that there are some uncertainties published alongside those if you want to do uncertainty analysis. Okay, good. So touching upon these quickly, we publish information on other factors as well. So temporal patterns have been shown to be moving towards being slightly more front-loaded with higher temperatures. That change is, though, relatively small. So there is information in the guidance if you wished to apply that change to your design flood estimation procedure. Spatial patterns, we do make comment on them, noting that the evidence currently points to some evidence points to increases, some evidence points to decreases. So we weren't able to provide guidance on spatial patterns, but acknowledging the evidence that's out there. We did have enough evidence to provide guidance on losses. Although I don't show the table here, it's very similar to what I presented for the rainfall intensity changes. There are factors provided across regions that are similar to the temporal pattern regions, and all one needs to do is apply those factors to your losses, and again, scaling them by the projected temperature increase globally. So exactly the same procedure as one would do for the rainfall intensities, noting that Australia is moving towards being a lot drier in the future, so the losses increasing. And we mentioned sea level rise, acknowledging that sea level rise will increase with climate change. Sea levels will increase with climate change. But there is another Engineers Australia document already that comments on this and provides guidance on this, as well as jurisdictional documents. So we point to those documents so we don't double up. There was a lot of feedback in the initial stages and during the entire process on what baseline should we use. So we need a baseline that represents the historical data, and the historical data, the IFDs, is roughly centered on 1961 to 1990. That's a good midpoint baseline because it corresponds to baselines that are used by climate scientists as well. So you can see with that black line, post that time, we've experienced warming, and so our IFDs need to be factored up to the current climate. There was also a lot of feedback on what climate scenario, what SSP should I use? One thing that needs to be pointed out is that there is no specific guidance in the ARR document given to what SSP or projection you should pick. I want to note here that up to 2050, the uncertainty is relatively small, but it does diverge a lot once one gets out to 2100. Because of that divergence, there's an example you might want to use adaptive management techniques, for example. So there is an example of that provided in the ARR document if you want to go down that path. As the ARR document doesn't provide information on what warming scenario you might use, there is actually documentation from DQ as part of the National Climate Risk Assessment First Pass Assessment Report, which provides some recommendations over which warming levels you might use. And you might notice that I've now changed my terminology from SSPs to warming levels or global warming levels. So global warming level simply means that you might reach, say, a 3 degree temperature increase compared to pre-industrial times by 2100. How the SSPs relate to global warming levels is also outlined in a document online, also published by this one under the authority of NES. So in terms of next steps moving forward, DQ are planning some stakeholder workshops to help users understand how the guidance relates to regulation, as well as how it can be used to support their decision making. So if you're interested, there's an email address there to register for the workshops. And on the next slide, I'll just give you those contact details again. So thank you very much.
Excellent. So what we're going to do now is have Monique join us for another presentation summarizing some of these, what this means for industry. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Gray. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some practical implications of the ARR Climate Change chapter. Firstly, I'll just tell you a quick update on some other things that are happening around the chapter updating. There are also other components of ARR that rely on the chapter or reference the chapter. So the ARR Data Hub is being updated to reflect the new values. At the moment, this will be located on the data, the development site for the Data Hub. The website is there. It'll be on there for about a week, and then those factors will move to the main site. The old factors will move to the legacy site. So I've got some screenshots there on the types of information that'll be available. The other thing is that there's going to be some very minor updates to other chapters in ARR that directly reference the climate change chapter to remove inconsistencies. There may be some left. There are over 300 references to climate change within the document, so we may not have found all of them. And I've got a list there of the chapters where the minor changes have occurred and they've been flagged within the document. The other thing is we're moving to a versioning system of ARR. So the climate change chapter will be part of version 4.2 that will be released. ARR 2019 will be renamed as version 4.1 and the 2016 version renamed to 4.0. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some practical implications of the guidelines on floodplain levels and design. So what we recognised was there was a need for widespread testing on the impacts of the climate change chapter. As you saw on the list of the project control group and working group, there's a lot of academics there, but not too many practitioners. So myself and my co-authors, Mark Babister, Bazad, Harry, Fabian and Nathan, we got together and we decided to do some testing. This part of my presentation, that's not formally part of the ARR update process. So we set about establishing a large data set of catchments based on the idea presented in Babister et al.'s paper at HWS last year that we need a national test data set, which we use each time we're updating ARR to test what implications the methods have. So our data set at the moment consists of 400 catchments. We've got 202 catchments that come from the New South Wales losses work. There's 162 Queensland catchments that are based on the work of Babister and Babister in 2022. And we've got 26 Victorian catchments and a number of synthetic urban catchments located at 9 locations around the country of 3 different sizes. So the test catchments, they range from 10 square kilometres up to 1,000 square kilometres, and we've set up WBNM models of all the catchments to the gauge. We've run all the standard ARR methodology, run all the durations and all the APs. So here I've got a map for all the test catchments that we've used, and the red dots represent the synthetic urban catchment locations. We've tested a range of scenarios, and we've run the historic 2016 IFDs. We've then run the 2030, 2050, 2090 scenarios. We've run 8 temperature increases. Now, the work I'm actually going to present is it will change because it's technically wrong. The temperature increases in the draft chapter actually changed a couple of days ago. So the estimates that we used are about 10% higher than what the final numbers in the chapter are. So today I'm going to focus on presenting the 1% AEP. So if we look at all the catchments, all the 400 catchments, we've plotted them here as the ratio of their peak flow in the climate change scenario versus the historic IFDs. We've got different symbols here for the different states. So a circle for Queensland, diamond for New South Wales, square for Victoria, and our synthetic catchments as well, all the way down to 1 square kilometres. And we're plotting the ratio of our peak outflow against the catchment area. And we've run various temperature increases. I've actually noted these as the temperature increase rather than SSP. So I guess if those numbers do change, you can just look at where you sit within these ranges. So what you can see here, there's quite a large scatter. At the smaller temperature increases, the points are quite confined, quite constrained together. And when we get up to the higher temperature increases, there's a large scatter. it's quite hard to see here with all the catchments. So if we focus down on one SSP, so I've got SSP3 here, we can see that the 2030 numbers are all kind of clustered around the 1.14. And the line looks straight there, but it does actually slope slightly towards the larger catchments having a slightly lower number. So what we thought then was, let's have a look at how this affects our changing in our flood planning levels. So for the New South Wales gauges that we had a number of high quality rating curves for, we had a look at how the 1% level changes at each gauge. And for the 4.5% degree temperature increase, which is kind of the worst case scenario, but the new numbers will be slightly less than this, we had flood levels changing by 0.2 to 2 metres, with most of the values between 0.3 and 1 metre. And so what we've done here is we've plotted them all, normalising the level increase against the temperature degrees increase. And we've got the 1-to-1 line there. And you can see it's all quite linear. So that was a really interesting finding, that while the magnitude of the changes are very location dependent, we see a very linear increase with temperature in our change in flood levels. So to assess the impacts of the guidelines without having to run your models a million times like we did, there is the climate change calculator, which is available, which will do some of those hard calculations for you to give you an idea of what's changing. Yeah, that's all I've got, Craig.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Monique, for that. That's some great content. I'd invite the other presenters to turn their cameras on. I can see why your session was standing room only and out the door at the FMA conference a few months back. A lot of interest in this subject. If anyone of the attendees, if you want to have a look at this yourself and try some of these things out, the links are in the chat line, or they'll be in the YouTube description on the recording. You may want to bookmark some of these because you're going to need to have a look at this for most of the practitioners here. We've got attendees from right around the world. We've got asset owners, people who are responsible for bridges or tailings dams or levees. And I'm sure everybody's wondering, what does this mean to me? How does this affect my bottom line? What's my cost-benefit ratio going to look like? What is my risk profile going to look like? If I thought I was protected against some given event, is that no longer the case? Lots of questions. Rory's been compiling these from the presenters and panelists and from other industry representatives over the last few months into some broad categories that we're going to pop up on the screen for you. So Rory's going to lead this section for the next hour or so that we'll be with you.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Well, I must admit, I've been fascinated by the questions that are rolling in, and decided to answer some of them that were easier to answer in 60 characters or less. But really, we're going to go through a process now of trying to collect some of these questions and put them to the panel, so we've got a slightly more complete answers and more nuanced. So bear with us. Keep the questions coming in, and we'll hope to get to them. But we've also had quite a bit of feedback prior to this in terms of the registrations, and informally, we've got a bunch of questions that we know have industry has asked in this process. So what we've done is we've collated just a few of the higher level ones. So we thought we might start with some of these we know are out there, and then we'll intersperse them with the ones that are coming in live now. And towards the end of this session, we'll be focusing, depending how quickly we go through this, focusing very much on the questions you're sending through now. And I think you'll find too, there's quite a lot of overlap in some of these questions. We'll do our best, given the number of people there and our desire to talk at length about our specialist subjects. But anyway, it's good to ask a question, and I'll put this to Leanne, if I could, as sort of the lead representative of the agency providing governance over this whole process. So the initiative for this, was this just a bunch of academics saying, let's make this more complicated, or was it industry saying clients are asking us to provide estimates, how do we do it? Or was it government saying we're not doing well enough? How did this come about?
Thanks, Rory. It was actually the latter. So the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy the Honourable Senator Jenny McAllister, actually wrote to Engineers Australia in 2022 to request their involvement in the project. And then we got a grant for the project, and the project commenced.
Well, Tony, I'm just trying to remember, was that she must have been in the role for very long before this came to the top of her to-do list.
Yes, that's correct. That was an election in 2022.
Yeah. No, I clearly seen procedures a problem. The second question I thought would put is, and a bit of a frustration because it was only, 2 or 3 years before the Minister wrote to Engineers Australia, that we've been through a very long process of revising the last version of ARR, which was only finalised in 2019. So, Seth, you're involved in both climate change chapters and had involvement in other parts of ARR. Why are we updating it so soon?
Yeah, thanks, Rory. So, I mean, as Monique mentioned in her presentation, 2019 was the year that ARR was most recently republished. It was that sort of version 4.1. And the previous version, I guess that version had some relatively minor changes in terms of the climate change chapter, had the addition of a small paragraph on practical applications. But the sort of the substantive guidance was really published in draft form in 2015 and in its final form in 2016. Now, the science that underpinned that guidance actually predates that even further. So the science that underpinned that is really from roughly 2013 or even before that. So I guess it would be fair to say that the science supporting that 2019 edition is really at least a decade old. And so I think it is quite timely that we have this update now.
But there's a 10-year gap, really, between the science and the publication in that instance. What's the gap this time around in the guidance, in the climate change gap chapter?
So there was a peer-reviewed publication that Conrad mentioned, the one that was published in HES, and that was really sort of published, I guess, over the last 12 months. So it's quite recent, and that was quite a comprehensive review of those 300 articles, everything really up until roughly that publication date. So it's a much tighter window, and we really made every effort to review the absolute latest science at the time that we were writing this guidance.
Yeah. Thanks, Seth. And Chris, I got to ask you, you've been both a consultant and now you're a regulator. You've sat on both sides of the fence. When you look at this guidance, you've been also involved in the technical working group. How do you see, what sectors of industry do you think this is relevant to?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, you could almost ask, what industry sectors don't need to pay attention to this. I think that's one of the big issues about climate change is that it is so pervasive and global, and the secondary consequences manifest as we go along, and unexpected consequences appear to will pop up. But focusing specifically on this chapter, if you think about uplift factors per degree on extreme rainfall, that really points towards anybody who's got a responsibility to something that's on a floodplain or is potentially impacted by flooding. For me, in my day job, that's certainly dams. And that's quite a big issue because they're very expensive pieces of infrastructure. I think that the other local governments, particularly those responsible for floodplain management, big headache I see for them, particularly when you're starting to look at some of these long life decisions, such as habitable floor levels and the like. But then, beyond that, I would say that any entity that's responsible for anything that resides in a floodplain for more than several years, you will need to start to consider this creeping and worsening impact.
And look, what's implied in your answer there is that there's not a lot of good news for asset owners. If you apply these guidelines, the flood magnitudes generally go up for any infrastructure of importance. So, Mike, can I ask you, we have to follow these guidelines.
Yeah, look, the answer to this is a clear yes. The philosophy of ARR is to use the best available information, and this clearly is. It's been developed by an expert group of researchers. It's been extensively peer-reviewed. There's no argument why you can't adopt it, so resounding yes.
Yeah, I guess it's if you don't like climate change, vote adults into Parliament that will hopefully slow down or mitigate the process.
Yeah, I should say it's now up on the ARR web pages as well as 4.2.
Right, and we might get, I think Monique might be able to answer that to Bill. In fact, do you want to just come in now since that's mentioned? Oh, no, it comes in later. So let's hold that, and there's an answer coming later on that. But, we often do come across problems with sort of overlapping guidance between a federal and state level. And climate change guidance is probably a really kind of clear example of that. So, Leanne, you're sitting in federal government. How does this? Is there much of a link or overlap, or are we going to trip ourselves up by applying the guidance that's in ARR? How does it link to other climate change guidance from other jurisdictions?
So I'm going to talk about the advice provided by the Australian government because state and local governments also provide advice on climate change, but we are pretty much joined up. So we do obviously have a role in working collaboratively with state and territory and local governments in the development and verification of climate assessment tools. And I would class this as a climate assessment tool. So in relation to the Australian government, we have a role in supporting emissions reductions, which cause climate change. We also have a role in supporting adaptation to the impacts of climate change. And this guidance specifically relates to adaptation. It's about sort of trying to improve our design of structures, infrastructure, trying to mitigate the impacts of future floods. So it really is about adaptation. So the role of the Australian government in this space is to provide national science and information to allow Australia to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to provide leadership on national adaptation reform, which is clearly what we've been doing through leading the development of this guidance. So other guidance that we have that's also relevant to this is, as Conrad mentioned before, we've developed the first pass of a national climate risk assessment, and that identifies plausible future climates and risks at 2050 and 2090 time horizons. And we're currently in the process of developing an adaptation plan to address some of these key risks. So again, that's the space of the Australian government, but we're clearly not working in isolation. We're joined up with the states and territories. The other thing that I would mention is the Australian Climate Service has been established to provide information on climate change. So that's at the national level, but again, we're joined up with the states and territories. And the mandate of the Australian Climate Service is currently under review by the government. Might leave it there, Rory.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I guess one way of looking at it is ARR is about how you go about deriving the estimates, and there's other guidance out there about how you make decisions based on those estimates. And that's probably more at the federal, state government level, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Rory, Acacia's got her hand up.
Thank you, Acacia.
I just wanted to add that I'm involved in the Australian Climate Service and parts of the National Climate Risk Assessment, and that process is taking the ARR review into account. This is a comprehensive body of work, and it's feeding into what information we're providing in the Australian Climate Service around extreme rain. So we hope, there's only as much as you can do, but we're trying our best across the climate science community to take advantage of this systematic process and make sure that the advice we're providing in different forms is consistent with the best available research, which was done as part of this review.
No, thanks for that. And Mark, did you want to make a comment, mate?
I was just going to add that quite a few of the states, and probably all of them, but I know a few of them are actively looking at providing a bit of background advice on how to deal with this new chapter of ARR.
Yeah.
So you'll hear something very soon. If they're managing a large portfolio of flood studies, so they want to have some baseline and have things done reasonably similar.
And it'll be beautifully well organised, perfectly coordinated, and no inconsistencies. It'll be fantastic.
Absolutely. I could probably just quickly add there that this is best practice. And I think it's important that we recognise it as such until somebody can really credibly come and argue against the content of this, which I think would probably be the next revision. But I think at this stage it is worth remembering that this will be considered as industry good practice or best practice, and that leads on so that guidance from various jurisdictions, be it state or federal or relating to a particular piece of infrastructure or approach, I would be very surprised if it doesn't lean into this climate change chapter and follow on from there.
Thank you. Oh, and I might move on a bit to just kind of that overall approach and defensibility. And I've noticed, and I gave an overly brief, unhelpful answer possibly in the chat earlier, but so we often hear in the media about, scientists arguing amongst themselves about the nature of the impacts. I was just wondering, perhaps, Seth, you've been in academia for many years. How do you see, how good is the consensus on the science on this?
Yeah, thanks, Rory. I mean, as you mentioned, I've been sort of in this area for well over a decade and sort of seen, I guess, the literature strengthen. And as I was sort of preparing for this webinar, I sort of was kind of reflecting on the first time I came across the sort of thinking that we're talking about in the guidance was actually a paper by a very renowned climate scientist called Kevin Trenberth back in 2003, where he suggested that extreme rainfall should increase at roughly the rate that the atmosphere holds moisture, which is that 7 to 8% per degree mark, and that for individual storms, that increase could be much greater than that, and that's where that sort of, those sub-daily sort of hourly type rates are much higher than that. So that was already well over 2 decades ago that thinking was already around. And since that time, I mean, there's been publication after publication that's come up with fairly consistent findings, slightly different numbers, depending on the methods, but broadly consistent. In Australia, we've had publications that show that extreme rainfall is actually increasing, so observed effects of increases since at least 2011. So again, more than a decade, with numbers that are broadly consistent with what's in this updated guidance. And that's been validated or verified with completely independent data sets like radar data, and then all the different climate modelling studies, such as what's been published by, produced by CSIRO and the UNSW Climate Centre, also saying very similar things. And so I guess back to that question of consensus, of course there's going to be uncertainty, and in fact, uncertainty ranges are published in this update, and maybe the exact numbers might vary a little bit from time to time. But I would say that, the studies broadly are in agreement with each other. They have been in agreement for quite some time, well over a decade, maybe even 2 decades. They agree across multiple lines of evidence, both instrumental and modelling evidence. And we're seeing the same stuff pop up in other parts of the world as well. And when you get independent experts like the technical working group come together to come up with what they think the overall evidence is saying, we get quite similar views across these different experts. So yes, I would say that there is quite a strong consensus now.
Thanks for that. Conrad, do you perhaps add a comment to that?
Yeah, look, I just forgot to mention that we also included authors from overseas, people who are responsible for updating the guidance documents in their countries as well, and they also found consensus with the guidance that or the science review that we published. So just mentioning that there was a international sort of review process there as well in terms of the document.
Well, since you made that point, I was going to ask you a bit later about what other countries are doing. So we had international people review recommendations of Australia. What about in their own backyard? So how consistent is what we're proposing with what's happening overseas in other countries?
Yeah, so we, as part of a previous study, we reviewed guidance documents overseas, and basically everyone who is factoring in climate change, they're doing something really similar, which is factoring IFDs. So that's pretty common now across many countries around the world to factor IFDs. The one sort of probably key difference is that we in Australia factor by a degree of warming, whereas other countries such as the UK, what they do is they just provide fixed factors for particular horizons. So our methodology probably offers a little bit more flexibility, but there's pros and cons to both. So that's really consistent. Also, the numbers themselves in terms of the increases that we found. So our scaling rates are very similar to New Zealand, so that's comforting in that sense. But the one probably the biggest difference is that our guidance is the first that at least that I'm aware of that factors up to PMPs and also includes other factors such as the antecedent conditions through losses.
Thank you, Al. There's a couple of points you made there I'll come back to later, but I might just keep on this theme for a little bit longer. And I guess really what you're saying is, by and large, there's elements of what we're doing is being replicated in other countries. So we're not kind of on our own out on a limb, particularly here. Possibly in some ways we're playing catch up in some respects. But I wouldn't mind asking Leanne too, in terms of, would you like to comment from a governance perspective about how you approach getting industry involved in the development of these guidelines?
Yeah, certainly. So as Conrad mentioned before, we established a project control group to guide the project and the technical working group to actually develop the guidance. So we intentionally invited industry to be part of that project control group because we recognise they're pretty much going to be the end users or the beneficiaries of this guidance. So the project control group included representatives from the hazard, the infrastructure and the insurance sectors. So that's how we got our industry involved.
Okay. And I think you could also comment, there was some, I'm losing track now of exactly where it makes most sense, but in terms of industry input was in sort of the PCG control of the process, but also in terms of providing feedback. And so the industries had a fair bit of involvement, I would have said, in responding to the draft guidelines. What was that period that was open to?
So the draft guidance, I believe, was open from December until December 2023 until March 2024. And yes, you're right. We did have a lot of input from industry on that draft guidance, as well as input through the governance of the project.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I might just quickly switch to. So I think there are a couple of questions on this kind of overall approach to defensibility. There's look, I guess just reinforcing a point, the query has been made that adopting these guidelines is going to just increase costs for owners. And what's the likelihood that we're wrong about this in terms of wrong about future temperature increases and wrong about that link between rainfall increases and temperatures? I just wonder, you may feel you've touched on that before, Seth. Do you feel there's any doubt about this?
I think the guidance, as I said, has been quite consistent now for a long period of time, and of course there are uncertainty ranges. I think when we ask this sort of question, we really need to ask it in two ways. What's the implication if we don't start changing our infrastructure to these things as well? Sometimes people talk about that as type 1, type 2 errors, like what happens if we overestimate climate change, but also what happens if we underestimate climate change in terms of some of the future consequences of that. And I think we've been quite conscious of trying to balance those two sides of the equation and really have something that's relatively even-handed. So it is possible that the numbers might even go up a little bit in the future, or they could change a little bit. I think every time it's revised, there might be little adjustments, but broadly, I think the uncertainty range that's been provided is probably going to stay quite stable for quite a period of time. And just to reinforce, we are seeing those changes. We've actually been seeing those changes for well over a decade. So this is not a hypothetical future scenario that a model was telling us might happen. This is stuff that we're actually seeing in all of our records in Australia and overseas, in the same way that we're seeing temperatures, change in real time.
Okay. So, like it or not, we're stuck with it, I guess, is the message. There are some questions coming up really about this whole SSP and should we make it temperature dependent, etc. And I might leave them till a bit later on the content. So allow me to come back to that. Perhaps it might be useful getting onto a little bit more substantive technical content rather than the higher level material. I might ask you, Conrad, now you've just given us a presentation, but let's imagine you stepped into a list with the Minister, Jenny McAllister. You've got 30 seconds. What are you going to say to the Minister? What's different about these guidelines from what was in there in 2019?
Okay, 30 seconds. So the difference is that we've now established a baseline. So there's a recognition that that the current climate has shifted from what it was previously. So we need to factor up our extreme rainfalls for the current climate. That's the one big sort of headline.
Jeez, I've got more the floor here, so that was more points.
That was only 10 seconds, probably. No, so look, the other key difference really is that we're incorporating science to vary those changes with storm duration now and factoring them up to the most extreme events up to the PMP. So trying to be as comprehensive as we can across the IFD spectrum, but also including climate science related to the antecedent moisture conditions as well. So factoring the losses is also quite a large difference from the previous guidance alongside other factors.
Okay, I think the list's arrived at the Minister's just stepped out, so let's move on. And there was a couple of questions on this in the chat I saw, and I might pass this one to you, Mark, if you don't mind, wearing your consulting hat here. You've just finished doing the flood study for a client, submitted the report in December last year, and now you're helping to launch guidelines of saying, actually, our current estimates aren't quite right. What's when do we have to redo it?
Yeah, this is a great question. Like, you don't need to redo everything right away. You can quickly do an approximation and work out where this new advice would land with the calculator or looking at some rainfall and changes. First thing, you don't need to do another map. And more importantly, previously in most flood studies, we've just been doing sensitivity on climate change. We need to move to a framework where we factor it into decisions. And that would be what I'd be saying to someone. Before you spend any more money on climate change, work out how you think you're going to factor it into decisions, because you need to start doing that now. And then maybe spend a little bit of money on an extra map, but make sure it's one you're going to use for decision making, not one that sticks in the back of a report nobody ever looks at.
So really, you've just touched on a point there. This is kind of quite a paradigm shift, isn't it? Like in the last guidance was, let's say if you want to take account of climate change and sensitivity analysis, now we're saying actually your prime estimate needs to incorporate climate change.
And that's the message I've been giving people. It's a now problem. It's no longer a future problem.
Yeah. Okay. And I'd perhaps switch back to you, Conrad, in terms of if we've, before I do ask that question, Chris, I'm just seeing your hand up. You're being very polite.
So, yeah, I'll be a bit more pushy from now on, Rory. Just a couple of comments on that. I mean, cheekily for me, I think if redoing another flood study is your only problem with climate change, you're doing pretty well. So I'd sort of take that as a positive if it's just a flood study. But I think that commentary about the sensitivity testing to something that is a reality now compared to what we had in 1990 is a really important paradigm shift for people to be aware of. And it's a similar thing with dam design. In the past, there was always a sensitivity test that incorporated climate change, whereas now it's more of a statement to say, here is a new risk position. How are you dealing with that new risk position? And I think that's sort of a lead on from Mark's response there is we're dealing with something that's happened and we are there now in that future.
Well, I might just actually segue from both your points there, Mark and Chris, and put a question to Acacia. It's come as a bit of a surprise to people that actually the IFD estimates we got from the Bureau of Meteorology just in 2019 were finalised. We're now saying factor them up it's a now problem. What did the bomb get it wrong? Why have we got this disconnect?
I think Conrad partially covered this in his talk, but I mean, that was a huge amount of work and it drew in a lot of data. A lot more time was spent on it than in this update. But a lot of that data comes from the period 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And if we were in a stationary climate, then that would still hold. But of course, the climate of now is a lot warmer than it was in the 1960s and 1980s. Even if you wanted to say, okay, we'll redo it with just the last 30 years of data, the climate of now is already warmer than it was in 1990. And we are starting, especially in the last decade, we've really started to see that emerge in the rainfall extremes. There have been quite a few studies in the last decade that we can already see that hourly, in particular, rainfall extremes are more intense than they were even 30 years ago. And so it doesn't invalidate the work that was done, but it just means we have to consider that the climate right now is a lot warmer than the climate that the data that went into that report was using. And so obviously that means that the rainfall estimates are going to be based on a slightly cooler climate that we need to factor into our planning.
Well, and can I ask, I see there was a question here in the chat about, we've got a bit of a tendency to ignore WA because it's so far away and it's so big with not great data density over most of its mass. Did we test these changes in WA? Did we include WA in the kind of factors that we've been considering here? We're saying it's Australia-wide. Do we have data in WA to back this up?
You're right that even into this, a lot of the best data and a lot of the analyses are focused on the southeastern states. So we do have more data on the southeastern states than we do in other parts of Australia. But climate modelling studies, for instance, are of course generally done Australia-wide, and they don't show any evidence at this point that the change factors are different in different parts of the country. That could change in the future as we get more information. But at the moment, from all the research we could tell, we couldn't find any robust evidence that the factors will be different in different parts of the country, except perhaps in southwest WA, but it's a very small part of a very large state.
All right. Now, Rory, just a quick interruption here. We're at our midpoint, so we've got a 60-minute discussion. We're 30 minutes into it. Want to remind all of the other presenters and panelists, while you're addressing your question, of course, give Rory your full attention. If this is something that's not directly relevant to you, if you can have a look at the open questions. We've got over 50 unanswered questions now from the attendees. Many of you have been doing some efforts in the background to answer those already. I'd encourage you to have a look at those and see if we can get as many of them grouped into the questions or the answers to the questions that Rory is posing for us now. So thanks for that. Back to you, Rory.
And so thanks, Craig. And it means if you've tuned out or you're answering a question and I ask you one, I'm very happy to repeat my question. So we're multitasking here. Well, there's some other questions there related to pre-burst, which is sort of a particular kind of engineering fix that we try and apply this fix to turn storm bursts into complete storms. So we're modelling the accounting for antecedent conditions in a more robust way. But perhaps, Conrad, I could ask you, these factors that Acacia and Seth are talking about, what do we do with them on pre-burst?
Yeah, so when climate science looks at extreme rainfalls, they're not making a distinction between what's the burst or what's the pre-burst. They're looking at extreme rainfalls in general. So you would apply the same scaling rates to pre-burst. That's the short answer.
Okay, thank you. That seemed to come up a bit. And another one that comes up a little bit too, I think there was a question in the chat there around the temperatures. We're using global temperatures. Seth, I might ask you, a lot of states have invested in things like high-res NARCLIN modelling or regional climate models, and should we be using those instead of global temperatures if we've got that information? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the short answer is no, and there's basically two reasons for that. The first being that the local temperatures are not necessarily actually a good proxy for how extreme rainfall will be changing. Sometimes there's other drivers like the temperature of the moisture source regions, which is often the surrounding oceans of Australia that are equally, if not more important. And also there's been quite a few studies that look at kind of correlations between changes in changes in extreme rainfall and both local and global temperature, and it often finds that there's a closer association actually with that global temperature trend. So that's reason number one. Actually, probably for me, a more compelling reason, though, is the fact that when we did our analysis of all the different studies, we were quite deliberate about normalizing every single study in terms of units of per degree global temperature change. And that was for the specific reason that it meant we could compare apples with apples, that every study was basically comparable on the same scale. And so that's the philosophy that we did for the guidance. So essentially, in table 1 of the guidance is the rainfall changes per degree temperature, and in table 2 is the global temperature change scenarios, and they're basically designed to go together so that there's an internally consistent set of changes that we work with.
Now, Keisha, too, you did a pile of work on this for the guidance. Is there anything you'd like to say about this, how we account for global versus local temperatures as well? That standardisation, I said.
So I think one thing that is really important to know is that the global temperature is a combination of land changes and ocean changes, and land areas are warming faster than the oceans. This means that the most recent evidence is that for Australia, temperatures are warming at about 1.4 times the rate of the global temperature change. So if you use local temperatures instead of global temperatures, you're actually going to have, in most cases, especially looking into the future, you'll be having larger temperatures and even larger rainfall factors. So if you think using local temperatures will give you a smaller change, that's not what you'll see. But yes, as Seth said, the global temperature better factors in the total amount of moisture available for rainfall, because when you have an individual rain event, you're having rain in Sydney, but a lot of the moisture that causes that rain is coming from the Coral Sea or even further away. And so you need to, so the local temperature is not the only factor in causing the rainfall that you're getting in your place.
Right, well, thanks for that. That's super clear answer from a climate scientist. But while we're talking about rainfalls, could I also ask you about, the focus here has been on shifting impact of rising temperatures on actual rainfall intensities. What about on how they sequenced in time? Are we going to see bigger clusters of storms occurring together, or fewer of them, or a changing mix of storm types and storm mechanisms? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question, and I think there hasn't been enough research to date on how clustering of extreme rainfall is going to change, because a lot of research just looks at the wettest event per year, and we know that often you'll have times like, in the last couple of years, we had many extreme events in a row. So that's an area of active research that I can't comment on at the moment. In terms of changing storm types, there's generally what we're seeing in Australia is a tendency towards fewer of those extratropical weather systems, like extratropical cyclones in the southern states. And, there's also a decrease in the frequency of tropical cyclones in the north. That doesn't mean that the rainfall from them will change. And in fact, the most intense and most heaviest rainfall can still increase even if the total number go down. But at the same time, there is evidence of an increase in thunderstorm-related rainfall in a lot of Australia. And so that's consistent with what we're seeing of a stronger tendency towards extreme sub-daily rainfall than in the daily totals as well. But there's still plenty of research to be done there as well.
Okay, thank you. And look, we've spent a lot of time talking on rainfalls, and clearly our focus at the end of this is what's it meaning for floods. Could I ask for perhaps a headline statement from you, Conrad, on the uplift factors that we're seeing in rainfall? Can we apply them directly to floods? What are there differences?
The short answer is it depends. When we looked at using global climate models for projecting floods across Australia, although the rainfall changes were quite consistent, like what Acacia said, across Australia, the floods projections really varied depending on where you were and how rare the event was.
Okay. And also, I suspect the severity of the floods would also, the direction of that change will depend on the severity of the floods.
Yeah, so I think like a really good example, and I was just looking at the numbers during the week, is the Murray Basin, for example, or WA that you brought up before. There's a huge trend towards drying in those areas. So the more frequent flood events, more frequent AEPs are actually projected to decline with climate change if you look at the climate models. And that really does extend up to, in the order of a 1 in 20 to a 1 in 50 event that they still have quite a large modulating impact just because of that really large change in the actual atmospheric conditions prior to the extreme rainfall.
Okay, thank you. And one of the things we often do to kind of make sure that when we transform rainfalls into floods, when we've got the data, like to reconcile it and compare it to flood frequency curves, let's say we've been through that process and we've gone and got our losses by comparing, by reproducing a flood frequency curve rather than straight out of the data hub, which are kind of our first guesses. Mark, what will we do if we spend effort already calibrating losses? We start over, or can we adjust them? What's happening?
So you've spent the effort doing some flood frequency analysis, and you've got some losses. So if you've done flood frequency analysis, you've got a long record, hopefully more than 30 or 40 years. And so the midpoint of your record's pretty much in the 1960 to 1990 period anyway. So you can pretty much apply the same adjustment. You could get very fancy and work out the exact midpoint, but I've done some calcs, and it's going to change your continuing loss in the eastern zones anyway by less than 0.1 for the continuing loss and less than 1 for the initial loss. And so my advice there is that's just a third order issue you're trying to deal with.
Yeah.
So don't overthink it.
Yeah, the loss factors we're seeing in the guidance, however you've derived your loss factors, if you're using historical data, we adjust them by those. We add 5% or whatever it is on average. Fair enough. Okay. We've had some questions too around two things that come up a fair bit. And one is, how do we use SSPs? How do we use degrees warming in scenarios? And one around the length of that planning horizon. I might perhaps first put to you, Seth, does the science stack up beyond 2100? Because there's a number of kind of procedures or critical assets where we're supposed to come up with 100-year design life, and we kind of hit a bit of at the moment, the guidelines seem to be silent on that. What do we do in those situations?
Yeah, look, I think this is a question that's coming up a lot because, as you said, particularly a lot of civil infrastructure does have very long design lives, but we have to keep in mind that trying to work out the impact of climate change on flooding, beyond 2100 is a really uncertain and sort of speculative, I guess, endeavor. And that's both because I guess we don't really know exactly what humanity is going to be doing around, addressing climate change and abating climate change, but also because of all these different physical processes and feedbacks in the climate system that become more uncertain the further we push, the planet away from, I guess, that historical equilibrium. And so the sort of uncertainties just propagate as you sort of get that far. And so for that reason, I guess in the guidance, we did emphasize that, I guess, the defensibility of trying to design things for specific climate change projections beyond 2100 is actually quite a questionable endeavor. So we're not really sort of encouraging that. What that does imply, I guess, is that, rather than trying to come up with better and more precise estimates of, the magnitude of flooding, we need to really think about how do we make decisions? How do we work in a more adaptive way to deal with this uncertainty, which unfortunately is not something that's going to go away.
So you're advising us not to invent data, but to change the way we make decisions.
Well, I think one of the big impacts of climate change is the fact that our uncertainty of risk is increasing. And so we really need to think about frameworks for how we assess and manage risk under that increasing uncertainty. Absolutely. So
that's a segue to you, Chris. Thanks for putting your hand up. I was about to ask you this question. Because we do have uncertainty ranges, just nice to see in this chapter. So as a regulator, in terms of your expectations of asset owners, how do we deal with our uncertainty? What are you expecting decision makers to do with that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things there. I've probably just to finish off on something that Seth was pointing out. It may, thinking about dates and then thinking about impacts, perhaps it might be worth thinking about the impacts and, at what point in the future or what temperature threshold in the future will be the point where you might consider designing to. And one of the things that I might suggest you think about there is what is the need of what you're designing for, and will it really be needed in that, this is where you start thinking about apocalypse and, some of the horrendous, forecasts in the 3 or 4 degree future and beyond. Quite unpleasant thinking process to try and understand what your limits are there. But it is a bigger thought. You just have to have a more of a holistic view on what those risks will mean in that kind of odd, distorted future that we might find ourselves in. So that's probably something up in that top scale there. Regarding how you deal with uncertainty with decision making, this is something which isn't specifically addressed in the climate change chapter, and I think quite reasonably it's focused very much on providing the numbers to say here's the factors per degree. So this question is really something for everyone to have a think about. To me, I think that there's a couple of other sections in Australian Rainfall and Runoff that talks about non-stationary risk assessments and adaptation processes. And it really does point to some basic fundamental questions. Firstly, can I ignore climate change in what I'm doing today? If I can't, can I meet an end of design life condition, future state today, and I'm comfortable doing that, I can afford it, or there's a very strong imperative for that piece of infrastructure to be robust. If you do say that yes to that, you probably would need to take on a conservative view of how you deal with your uncertainty. So if you're going to build for end of life, it's going to have to be, a conservative end of life. And then probably the more likely scenario for most would be the adaptive approach, where you may well start planning today to address the future, knowing that this may not be the end of the story. You might be addressing something for a 5 or 10 year horizon, but things are going to likely get worse after that 5 or 10 year horizon. So you need to start thinking about what you do subsequently. So that means, do you build in resilience now? Do you save that and build it in later? These are very challenging questions. There's a lot of common guidance available in literature around the world about how you would do this, but it's got that fairly common theme there. And I think that's probably the way a lot of us will be going, thinking about that adaptive management approach.
Right. Thank you. Look, it's a little bit outside of the scope of the guidelines, but I think increasingly hydrologists kind of need to understand what the consequences of being above or below the best estimate mean in terms of helping decision makers come at that point. Mark, do you want to provide a comment on that?
I was just going to say an adaptive management approach is really good, but my bit of advice for anybody who owns an asset out there is to make sure you do enough homework now and enough documentation now so the person who's going to do it in 20 or 30 years' time knows exactly what they're starting with if they're raising a levy or upgrading something. Because every time I work on a project, we never know what the condition of the levy was, or how it was compacted, or what was assumed. So there is a bit of an onus on there. Adaptive management is great, but make it easier for the person who follows you.
I think there's certainly a clear practice in the dams industry to keep those kinds of records, but possibly not so much in some of the other wider assets that we're dealing with, for sure. Look, can I come back? I'm just being prompted that there's a couple of questions we've had around. We're all talking about, effectively, we've only talked about rainfall-based techniques in the discussions to date. Look, Seth, would you enter a comment on why are we applying uplift factors directly to flood frequency curves?
So, I think Conrad mentioned it when he sort of suggested that different catchments, different parts of the country are all different. And so it's very hard to just extrapolate historical flood risk without knowing what caused it, what the processes were. I mean, there's other things usually that are happening in catchments that have got nothing to do with climate change, like changes in land cover, urbanisation and whatnot as well. So just looking at historical flood trends and saying, okay, this is going to continue without recourse to the physical processes that are causing those floods, I think is potentially a bit dangerous. So by focusing on, rainfall, which is clearly, there's clear understanding of how that's linked to climate, and then, other things like anti-sea conditions and sea level rise and so forth if you're on the coast. Because we know a little bit more about how those will change, that's the starting point, and then working out, what does that imply for flood risk?
Thank you. Yeah, look, and certainly I think the literature on that is a bit rather more complex to interpret and apply. I think probably a bit more challenging for most practitioners than it is with the approach that's outlined in the guidance. Or Trey coming in and keeping us at time. That's Conrad. I could ask you, Minister McAllister has got back in the lift and you're now going down. Her question to you is, are there any pressing research questions that we haven't yet addressed that we really need to?
Yeah, look, I think the best way to answer is really looking at the feedback that we got from the community consultation. One of them was people are really interested in their regional impacts, and although Acacia's spoken to the fact that the rainfall changes are pretty consistent across Australia, we do need to continue to provide science to support that, to, I guess, enhance confidence in the numbers that we're providing. So I think looking at regional impact, and the other thing that really came back was continuous simulation is a methodology that is used, and it's not that straightforward to adjust continuous rainfall sequences for climate change, knowing that extreme rainfalls are increasing, mean rainfalls are declining, there's a change in the intermittency and sequencing of events. So coming up with practical methods in order to do that, I think, is also another research consideration in the near future.
Thank you. And there were some questions in the chat I saw about, continuous simulation, and it kind of solves some problems very neatly and it introduces others. And in this space, that's certainly the case.
I think the hard thing is there's no one size fits all sometimes solution, and continuous simulation falls into that category. Yeah.
I wouldn't mind asking Leanne again, and just in terms of when all this is going to be finalised. We've been through a period of public comment on the draft. Things seem to have gone a bit quiet the last few months. Could you give us an update on where we're at with this?
Certainly. So the update is final and it's ready to use. And I understand that if it's not already available through the ARR website, it will be very soon, either today or tomorrow. So it's final and it's ready to use. The science is not going to change. We are, however, as you would have seen from Conrad's presentation, we are working with Engineers Australia to have some workshops in jurisdictions over November, December this year. And the purpose of those workshops, we're really taking the time to work with decision makers and practitioners to try and understand the types of decisions that people want to use this guidance for. And then once we understand that might influence how the guidance could be applied. So we'll understand how the guidance could be applied. And based on the information that we receive from these workshops, we might look at supplementing the guidance with some further explanations and detail to support people in consistent application of the guidance. So we're not going to change the numbers, those numbers are right, but we might change some of the explanation around how you might go about using the guidance just to make it clearer. And that's really the purpose. So if we did do that, any supplementation to the guidance would occur by March 2025 is what we would be expecting.
Thank you. I just saw Monique. Do you want to just reappear with magic of technology? I've had some emails from you very late at night at very strange times of the day trying to get all this done. Do you want to just comment on what state we're at in terms of how accessible this is publicly? Leanne said it's finished and released.
Yeah, so at this point in time, we're just working on getting all of the elements live. So there the PDF of the full document is available. We're working on loading up the books. They should be going up very shortly if they're not already up there while we're talking. We're working on the EPUB and the HTML website going live, so they're not live yet. And the development site for the Data Hub is live. But within the next few hours, today, tomorrow morning, it should all be live and accessible by everyone.
But for those on using their phones to have a look at it, it's 120 megabyte download at the moment.
Definitely some people in the questions have already loaded it already, so.
Oh, okay. Oh, fantastic. I mean, is there links being provided in the chat as it for where that...
I haven't done that. I can do that.
Okay. So, and Mark, can I ask you, we've now got these guidelines, they're now released. Who owns it? Who looks after it? What happens?
This is a great question, Rory. So ARR is owned by Engineers Australia. It has been since it was first published in 1958 and still is, despite people thinking GA. And the custodian's the National Committee on Water Engineering. It's their job to look after that. But have to acknowledge we have to partner with organisations like DICU to do climate change. We partnered with GA for the last update. So we have to work with other organisations. We can't fund these updates, and sometimes it's much better to bring in some advice from some specialty groups. Going forwards, there are parts of ARR that need updating, and there'll be more as further in the future. And that presents a real challenge for Engineers Australia and the National Committee because it is a mammoth task.
Well, Chris, how often, where would you like to see it revisited?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I just would echo Mark's comments there that, well, actually, just to go back a couple of steps, one of the things that struck me was having conversations with people over the last 6 months to a year, asking when this climate change chapter would be updated, because that's when they would be able to start dealing with climate change. And I kept saying to them, look, the science is out. You know, we've published Conrad and Seth and yourself published this journal paper quite some time ago. Really, this is just about underscoring that. So that is firstly, it's quite humbling to be part of Australian Rainfall and Runoff and know just how important that is to the industry. It's not until ARR says it's so that we are then compelled to do something about it. It's almost like IPCC. ARR says climate change is real, so we'll do something about it. So for the climate change chapter, I would not be thinking that we would need to make any changes to that until something refines the science, and then there is a scientific literature reference that we would then be able to use. Going forward, though, I would like to see a bit more activity in ARR, and I think many other people would. We have to strike that balance between various chapters updating frequently and, you know, whether that changes the goalposts too quickly for legislators and the industry. But certainly I'd be hoping that we see some more activity in the near future.
Okay, thank you. I want to hand over to Craig, but Monique, you've got a comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, if I can just add to that, the National Committee has been working on a process to update ARR, and they've tasked a number of the previous editors at writing a document that looks at the lessons learned from ARR 2019 in that process, identifying a future process and expanding that to including a history of the document. So that will be presented at HWS HIWE 2024 in November in Melbourne.
Oh, well, that will be interesting to read. Okay, Ray, I might hand over to you, I think.
All right, well, thanks for that. I would say this is probably one of the largest concurrent gatherings of water professionals ever. When do you get 2,000 people from around the globe together at the same time interacting? So thanks so much. We've had over 100 questions, looks like, in the Q&A line If your question wasn't answered individually, I hope the way Rory categorized the responses, we've hit most of them. But in any case, we'll post the written responses to the Australian Water School's website, and we'll include a link to that document in the YouTube description. Thanks so much to all the presenters. Thanks especially to all the attendees for your participation. In addition to the written questions that we've seen come through, we've also had a ton of reactions coming through during the session. And as I kind of collate those, I think the emoji of the day is the astonishment icon. There's a lot of attendees kind of gasping at how much more water our warmer air can pick up and then drop on us. And I think the take-home message, if you've been in the habit of using historical data for right now and only incorporating climate change for projects that extend way out into the long term, I think what's been demonstrated by our speakers today is that we're already using outdated estimates to assess our risk right now. And so when you get tailings dams and other infrastructure that's now potentially under-designed, we may be looking at a bunch of ticking time bombs, which can be a bit scary, but I am encouraged that we've had, again, a couple thousand practitioners register for this webinar, and that really encapsulates why we have professional development to begin with. Why do licensing boards require this? Why can't you just get your degree and then continue with what's on your bookshelf? I think in terms of the best use of our time in doing this and trying to stay current with the industry, it's a forum like this where we get an interactive session with the top experts in the fields, those who wrote the book. I want to just give everyone a chance to just kind of sum up closing remarks for everybody. Where do we go with this? Maybe just do it in the order that we see it here. Acacia, any closing remarks?
I hadn't thought about closing remarks, but just, I guess one of the things about extreme rainfall is it's probably one of the areas, apart from extreme temperatures, where we have the most confidence in climate change. So, while I know this is a lot of work for some people, perhaps feel grateful that at least we can tell you something with confidence, which we can't say as easily for some of the other questions that people ask us about when designing, say, for extreme winds.
Exactly. Conrad, anything you'd want to leave us with?
Look, I guess, we've tried really hard to provide as much data as we can. And I think, if there isn't data there for your decision making, I'd put an open question to maybe we should think about how we actually do our decision making as a result.
Great. Chris?
Oh gosh, I think I've just about said everything I was meaning to say. I think get out and use it and tell us how you're going to go with the next 20 to 50 to 100 years. Good luck.
Sounds good. Seth?
Yeah, it looks similar. I mean, there's been a huge amount of effort sort of put into trying to collate the science and say what's happening and what's likely to happen in the future. But I think now the question is really to the community, what do we do about it? How do we respond to some of these changes?
Perfect. Leanne?
So climate change is with us now, and adaptation is probably the unsung thing that we need to work on. So we know that we've got to stop emissions, but we've also got to adapt to those locked-in changes that we're already starting to see. So this is the first pass on the flood risk.
Mark?
I think I'd say if you're in local government and you're overwhelmed, you should probably try talking to state government about what their policy and response is going to be and what the scenario should be. So I'll probably lose a few friends over that comment, but
excellent.
My speech.
Excellent. Monique's been doing a lot in the background, funneling some questions over to Rory, collating everything you've been asking. Monique, any closing remarks?
I think the important thing now is to actually start using these numbers in design. It's nice to do sensitivity runs. It makes consultants rich, but let's actually incorporate this into our flood planning levels and our designs for infrastructure.
Excellent. Rory, bring it home for us. Thanks so much for chairing this and such a well-organized session. So much preparation went into this. You can't imagine those attendees, how much went into this to get it running as smoothly as it has. Bring it home for us, Rory.
Well, for me, I think the best thing about this whole process has been we have distilled literally hundreds of papers in the actually international literature and distilled it down to some guidance. So I'd like to think it's actually going to be when you actually look at it and go to apply it, you'll find actually this is pretty easy. You're just taking rainfalls, you're factoring them up, you're taking losses, you're factoring them up. If you do those two things in the way it's described, you are doing you're making a big leap forward in terms of coming up with design estimates that account for global warming. So I'd like to think that for me it's a really nice exercise in distillation and a rapid transfer of research into practical guidance.
Excellent. And if you want to hear more from Roy, Mark, all of our presenters, I think many of them have been with us before. A lot of free webinars that are out there on some content that you can watch right now on, what's going on with climate change, extreme events, PMFs, PMPs. Stay tuned. Do subscribe because we're going to have some coursework coming up. How do you estimate the PMF and incorporate this new guidance into that these days? Have a look at this QR code. If you're on your computer screen, you can scan it with your phone and register for the ARR On-Demand Training Series. So with that, thanks so much to all of our presenters, panelists, and attendees, especially forward. So thanks so much for your time today. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time with the Australian Water School.